Part 1. The Illusion. The juvenile courtroom in Harris County, Texas, was designed with a specific philosophy in mind. Unlike adult criminal courts, with their imposing architecture and atmosphere of punitive severity, this space had been constructed to acknowledge that the people being judged were children, that their brains were still developing, and that the purpose of the proceedings was as much about rehabilitation as it was about punishment. The walls were painted in soft, neutral tones, the furniture was less intimidating, even the judge's bench, while elevated, was not as dramatically positioned as it would be in an adult courtroom. But on the morning of September 14, 2021, the carefully calibrated atmosphere of rehabilitation and second chances would be tested by the presence of a boy who seemed fundamentally incapable of recognizing the gravity of his situation. His name was Tyler Brennan, and he was 13 years old. He sat at the defense table wearing clothes that had been selected by his attorney to project an image of youthful innocence: a button-down shirt slightly too large for his thin frame, khaki pants, and shoes that looked like they had been purchased specifically for court appearances. But the clothes could not disguise what was evident in his posture, his expression, and the faint smirk that played at the corners of his mouth. Tyler believed with absolute conviction that he was going to walk out of this courtroom a free person. This conviction was not based on any reasonable assessment of the evidence against him. It was not the result of legal advice from his attorney or reassurances from his family. It was something else entirely: a profound disconnect between Tyler's understanding of himself and the reality that everyone else in the courtroom could see clearly. He believed he was smarter than the system, more clever than the prosecutors, more capable of manipulation than the judge was capable of perceiving. He believed, in the particular way that certain adolescents believe things, that the rules that applied to other people simply did not apply to him. The crime that had brought Tyler to this courtroom was not a matter of dispute. On the evening of June 3rd, Tyler had killed his neighbor, a man named Robert Chen, age 67. The killing had been deliberate, premeditated, and executed with a level of violence that was shocking even to seasoned law enforcement officers who had investigated hundreds of homicides. Robert Chen had been stabbed 32 times in his own home, the attack so sustained and so brutal that forensic analysts would later testify that it suggested not a momentary loss of control, but a prolonged, deliberate effort to end another person's life. Tyler had confessed to the crime. The physical evidence was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found throughout the victim's home. His DNA was recovered from beneath the victim's fingernails, evidence of a struggle. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife taken from Robert Chen's own cutlery set, had been found in Tyler's bedroom, wrapped in a towel, and hidden in his closet, still bearing traces of the victim's blood. And yet, Tyler sat in the courtroom with an expression that suggested he was participating in a minor inconvenience, a bureaucratic process that would soon conclude with his return to normal life. He whispered to his attorney during testimony, occasionally letting out small laughs at things only he found amusing. He made eye contact with the jurors and the gallery, his gaze steady and challenging, as if daring them to find him guilty, confident that they would not. His attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Sandra Yates, had spent months trying to prepare Tyler for the reality of what he was facing. She had explained the evidence. She had walked him through the potential sentences. She had, in increasingly desperate tones, tried to make him understand that his arrogance and his complete lack of remorse were destroying any possibility of a sympathetic verdict. But Tyler had listened to her warnings with the same detached amusement he brought to everything else, nodding in a way that suggested agreement, while clearly believing that she simply did not understand how intelligent he was, how capable he was of charming a jury, how certain it was that he would be acquitted, or at worst given a minimal sentence in a juvenile facility from which he would be released when he turned 18. The courtroom was filled with people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by Tyler's actions. Robert Chen's family sat in the front row, his wife of 40 years, his 2 adult children, his grandchildren. They watched Tyler with expressions that ranged from grief to incomprehension to barely contained rage. How could a 13-year-old boy have done this? How could someone so young be capable of such calculated violence? And how could that same boy sit in a courtroom facing judgment for ending a beloved man's life and smile? Robert Chen had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan in 1979, arriving with an engineering degree, limited English, and a determination to build a life that would provide opportunities for his future family. He had worked initially in a manufacturing plant, long hours for modest pay, slowly improving his language skills and saving money with a discipline that was almost ascetic in its rigor. By the time he was 30, he had started his own small business, a computer repair shop that operated out of a rented storefront in a strip mall. The business had grown steadily over the decades, eventually expanding to 3 locations and employing 15 people. Robert had a reputation for honesty and fair pricing, for treating customers with respect regardless of their technical knowledge, and for mentoring young people who showed an interest in learning about technology. He had married his wife, Susan, in 1981. They had 2 children, a daughter, Michelle, who became a physician, and a son, David, who followed his father into the technology industry. He was immensely proud of his children, and by extension, of the 4 grandchildren they had given him. He was the kind of grandfather who attended every school play, every soccer game, every piano recital, whose presence was a constant and dependable feature of his grandchildren's lives. He had retired at 65, selling his business to one of his longtime employees at a price that was fair but not particularly advantageous to himself. He wanted, he told his family, to spend his remaining years enjoying the fruits of his decades of labor, traveling with Susan, spending time with his grandchildren, and working in the garden that he had cultivated behind his modest suburban home. The neighborhood where Robert and Susan lived was called Meadowbrook Estates, a collection of single-family homes built in the 1970s, populated largely by older couples whose children had grown and moved away. It was quiet, safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. Robert was particularly well-liked, the neighbor who would help with car trouble, who would lend tools without needing them returned promptly, who would engage in long conversations about politics or history or the nature of good engineering. 3 houses down from the Chens lived the Brennan family. James Brennan was an insurance adjuster, frequently traveling for work. His wife, Patricia, worked as a part-time administrative assistant at a medical office. And their son, Tyler, was 13 years old, an 8th grader at the local middle school, known to his teachers as intelligent but socially difficult, known to his parents as a child they increasingly did not understand. Robert Chen had interacted with Tyler occasionally over the years. He had helped Tyler with a school science project when Tyler was 10. He had allowed Tyler to use his garage when Tyler wanted to work on building a small robot for a competition. He had been, by all accounts, kind to the boy, patient with his questions, generous with his time. And in return, Tyler had killed him. The investigation into what had motivated Tyler Brennan to murder Robert Chen would consume hundreds of hours of detective work, psychological evaluation, and testimony from people who knew both the victim and the perpetrator. But even after all that investigation, the answer remained frustratingly incomplete. There was no clear motive, no precipitating incident that explained why a 13-year-old boy would decide to brutally murder a neighbor who had been nothing but kind to him. What investigators were able to piece together was a timeline of events that led to the evening of June 3rd. Tyler was experiencing increasing behavioral problems at school. He had been suspended twice in the preceding 6 months, once for fighting with another student, once for threatening a teacher who had given him a failing grade on an assignment. His parents had been called to multiple conferences with school administrators, where they were told that Tyler exhibited signs of oppositional defiant disorder, that he seemed to have difficulty accepting authority, and that they should consider having him evaluated by a mental health professional. Patricia Brennan had made an appointment with a child psychologist, but Tyler had refused to attend. When she tried to force the issue, he had responded with such intense anger, throwing objects, screaming, making threats, that she had backed down, telling herself that maybe he would outgrow this phase, that maybe this was just normal teenage rebellion amplified by stress. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Tyler's internet search history would reveal a disturbing pattern. He had been researching violence, how to kill someone without being caught, how to stage a crime scene, what kinds of evidence could link a perpetrator to a victim. He had visited forums.
The evidence. The forensic evidence against Tyler Brennan was overwhelming. Beyond the fingerprints found at the crime scene, investigators discovered the murder weapon in Tyler's closet, still wrapped in the dish towel he had used to carry it home. The knife bore both Robert Chen's blood and Tyler's fingerprints. DNA evidence recovered from beneath Robert's fingernails matched Tyler's genetic profile. The scratches on Tyler's face and arms, visible during his interrogation, were consistent with defensive wounds inflicted by the victim. Tyler's computer was seized and forensically analyzed. What investigators found painted a disturbing picture of a young man who had been fascinated with violence for months, if not years. His search history included queries like, how to get away with murder, do 13-year-olds go to adult prison, and what evidence do police need to convict someone? He had visited forums where users discussed violent fantasies and had posted under a pseudonym about wanting to know what it feels like to kill someone. His social media accounts, examined by investigators, showed a boy who presented a carefully curated image to the world, smiling photographs with family, posts about school activities, interactions with peers that seemed normal on the surface. But his private messages told a different story. He had messaged several people expressing contempt for adults, for authority figures, for the idea that anyone had the right to tell him what to do. One message, sent to a classmate 2 weeks before the murder, read, "Everyone thinks they're so important, but they're not. Anyone can just stop existing and nothing really changes. I could make someone stop existing and no one would even blame me because I'm just a kid." The classmate had not understood the message as a threat or a confession of intent. They had assumed Tyler was being edgy, trying to sound dark and interesting in the way that some teenagers do. They had not reported it to any adult. Psychologists evaluated Tyler extensively. They found a boy with above-average intelligence, no signs of psychosis or delusion, and a capacity to understand right from wrong. What they did find was a profound lack of empathy, an inflated sense of his own importance, and a belief that he was fundamentally different from and superior to other people. The clinical term was narcissistic personality traits with antisocial features, though the psychologists were careful to note that Tyler was still an adolescent and that personality disorders were difficult to definitively diagnose in someone so young. But the pattern was clear. Tyler believed the rules did not apply to him, that he was smarter than the people trying to hold him accountable, and that ultimately he would escape serious consequences because he always had before. The trial. The decision to try Tyler as an adult was not automatic. Texas law allowed for juveniles as young as 14 to be transferred to adult court for certain serious offenses, but Tyler was only 13. The prosecution filed a motion for discretionary transfer, arguing that the nature of the crime, premeditated murder, extreme violence, no apparent remorse, warranted adult proceedings. The defense fought the transfer vigorously. Sandra Yates argued that Tyler was still a child, that his brain was not fully developed, that the juvenile system was specifically designed to handle cases like this where rehabilitation was still possible. She presented testimony from experts on adolescent brain development who explained that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding long-term consequences, was not fully mature in a 13-year-old. But the judge, after reviewing the evidence and listening to arguments from both sides, ruled that Tyler would be tried as an adult. The crime, he said, was simply too severe, too calculated, and too violent to be addressed within the juvenile system. Tyler's complete lack of remorse and his continued arrogance throughout the proceedings suggested that he posed a significant danger to society. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The physical evidence linking Tyler to the crime scene, the murder weapon found in his possession, the DNA evidence, the disturbing internet search history. They called Robert Chen's family to the stand, allowing the jury to understand the magnitude of the loss, to see the victim as a real person whose life had been stolen. They played the interrogation video, allowing the jury to see Tyler's demeanor, the casual indifference, the attempts at manipulation, the flash of contempt when he was confronted with evidence. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, to suggest alternative explanations for the evidence, but there were no alternative explanations that held up under scrutiny. Sandra Yates' strategy shifted to mitigation, arguing that even if Tyler was guilty, he deserved leniency because of his age, because he could still be rehabilitated, because sentencing a child to life in prison was fundamentally unjust. Throughout the trial, Tyler's behavior undermined his own defense. He sat at the defense table with visible boredom, occasionally smirking when testimony was particularly damning. When photographs of Robert Chen's body were shown to the jury, several jurors looked away, visibly distressed. Tyler stared at the images with what appeared to be curiosity rather than horror. His attorney repeatedly whispered to him to control his expressions, to appear solemn, to show some indication of regret. He would comply for a few minutes, arranging his face into a more appropriate expression, and then would lapse back into his default state of smug confidence. During breaks, he would joke with the bailiffs, asking them questions about their jobs, seeming genuinely interested in the mechanics of the courthouse. He asked his attorney if the jury members would be willing to sign autographs after the trial, a question that left Sandra Yates momentarily speechless. "Tyler," she said carefully, "you understand that if you're convicted, you're going to prison, potentially for a long time." "I'm not going to be convicted," Tyler said with absolute certainty. "They don't have enough evidence, and even if they do, I'm 13. They're not going to send a 13-year-old to adult prison. That's not how it works." Sandra wanted to scream at him that yes, that was exactly how it worked, that he was living in a delusion that was going to destroy him, but she simply nodded and returned to her preparation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Tyler's expression did not change. He looked at the jury with a faint smile as if they had made a mistake that would soon be corrected. He looked at his attorney as if to say, "Don't worry, we'll fix this on appeal." He did not look at Robert Chen's family. The sentencing. 2 weeks after the verdict, the court reconvened for sentencing. This was the moment that would determine Tyler's future, whether he would receive a lengthy but finite sentence or whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence allowed by law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. They argued that Tyler had demonstrated through his behavior that he was incapable of rehabilitation, that he posed a continued threat to society, that the severity of his crime demanded the most severe response available. The defense argued for leniency. Sandra Yates presented testimony from experts who explained that adolescent brains were plastic, capable of change, that Tyler could be rehabilitated with appropriate intervention. She argued that sentencing a child to die in prison was cruel and unusual punishment, that it violated basic principles of justice and human dignity. Robert Chen's family was given the opportunity to present victim impact statements. His wife Susan spoke through tears about the man she had loved for 40 years, about the future they had planned together, about the grandchildren who would grow up without their grandfather. She looked directly at Tyler as she spoke, and he looked back at her with an expression that suggested mild interest but no emotional engagement. Her daughter Michelle spoke about her father's kindness, his generosity, his impact on everyone who knew him. She spoke about how her children asked when Grandpa was coming to visit, how she had to explain to them that he was never coming back. And then she turned to Tyler. "You took my father from us," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You ended his life for no reason, and you sit here acting like this is all some kind of joke. But it's not. This is real. My father is dead because of you, and I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life understanding what you have done." Tyler watched her speak, and when she finished, he shrugged slightly, as if to say, "Are we done now?" Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over hundreds of cases in her 20 years on the bench. She had sentenced murderers, rapists, armed robbers. She had seen the worst of humanity pass through her courtroom. But she would later say that Tyler Brennan disturbed her in a way that few defendants ever had, because he seemed fundamentally incapable of understanding that other people were real, that their suffering mattered, and that his actions had consequences. "Tyler Brennan," she said, her voice filling the courtroom, "stand and face me." Tyler stood, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in his expression. Not fear exactly, but perhaps the beginning of an awareness that this moment was not going to unfold the way he had anticipated. "You have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree," the judge.
The breaking point. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the courtroom itself needed time to process what had just been said. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A 13-year-old child sentenced to spend every remaining day of his life behind bars. Tyler's expression changed. The smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked like genuine shock. He turned to his attorney, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Sandra Yates was looking at him with an expression that mixed pity and exhaustion, as if she had known this was coming but had hoped, against all evidence, that she might be wrong. "Your Honor," Sandra said, standing, "we respectfully request." "Your request for reconsideration is noted and denied," Judge Morrison said. "The sentence stands." Tyler was looking around the courtroom now, his eyes moving from face to face as if searching for someone who would tell him this was a mistake, that it couldn't actually be happening. He saw the jury members, some of whom were looking at him with expressions of satisfaction, others with what looked like sadness. He saw Robert Chen's family, Susan Chen staring at him with red-rimmed eyes. He saw his own mother in the gallery, her face buried in her hands. "No!" Tyler said, his voice barely audible. "No, that's not... I'm 13! You can't..." "Bailiff," Judge Morrison said. 2 court officers moved toward Tyler, preparing to escort him from the courtroom, and that was when the armor of arrogance that Tyler had worn for so long finally, completely shattered. "Wait!" Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. "Wait, I didn't mean to..." The lie was transparent, a last desperate attempt to salvage something from a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. But it was too late for lies, too late for manipulation, too late for anything except the reality of what he had done and what he would now face. "Please," Tyler said, and now there were tears on his face, genuine tears, perhaps the first genuine emotion he had displayed throughout the entire process. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I didn't think..." The bailiffs took his arms, gently but firmly, and began to lead him toward the door that would take him out of the courtroom and into the system that would hold him for the rest of his life. Tyler struggled against them, not violently but with a kind of panicked desperation, trying to turn back toward the judge, toward his mother, toward anyone who might intervene. "Mom!" Tyler screamed. "Mom, help me! Don't let them do this!" Patricia Brennan was sobbing, her husband's arm around her shoulders.
She did not move to help her son. There was nothing she could do. Tyler was pulled through the door, and the last sound anyone in the courtroom heard from him was a long, wailing cry that carried all the terror and regret and understanding that he should have felt from the beginning but had been too arrogant to allow himself to experience. The door closed, and the courtroom was silent except for the quiet weeping of both families. The family that had lost a beloved patriarch, and the family that had lost their son, not to death, but to something that felt equally permanent. The aftermath. Tyler Brennan was transferred to a maximum security juvenile facility where he would remain until his 18th birthday, at which point he would be transferred to an adult prison. The facility was designed to house the most violent juvenile offenders in the state, young people who had committed crimes so severe that they could not be placed in standard juvenile detention. In the first weeks of his incarceration, Tyler continued to assert that there had been a mistake, that the sentence would be overturned on appeal, that he would not actually spend his life in prison. But as the weeks turned into months, and as his appeals were systematically denied, the reality of his situation began to penetrate the delusion he had constructed. He had believed he was special, that his intelligence would protect him, that the system could not actually touch him, and he had been wrong about all of it. The psychological evaluations conducted during his incarceration showed signs of depression, anxiety, and a growing awareness of what he had lost. The arrogance that had characterized his behavior during the trial was gone, replaced by a hollow despair. He began to understand, finally, that Robert Chen was a real person, that his death had meaning, that the suffering of his family was genuine and permanent. Whether this understanding constituted genuine remorse or simply grief over his own circumstances was a question that psychologists debated, but there was no question that Tyler had changed, that the smirking 13-year-old who had sat in the courtroom convinced of his own invincibility had been replaced by someone who understood, too late, the magnitude of what he had done. Robert Chen's family attempted to move forward with their lives, though the loss remained a permanent wound. Susan Chen spoke at victim impact panels, sharing her story with the hope that it might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. She advocated for better mental health screening for adolescents, for earlier intervention when warning signs appeared, for a system that might catch children like Tyler before they acted on their violent impulses. She was asked, during one of these panels, whether she believed Tyler deserved the sentence he received. Her answer was quiet but firm. "I don't know if anyone deserves to die in prison for something they did when they were 13, but I know my husband deserved to live, and that choice was taken away from him. So yes, there have to be consequences. Whether those consequences are just, I leave that for others to decide. I only know that my husband is gone, and nothing will bring him back." The questions. The case of Tyler Brennan raised profound questions about the intersection of age, culpability, and justice. Legal scholars, psychologists, and advocates on both sides of the juvenile justice debate used his case as an example to support their positions. Those who argued for more lenient treatment of juvenile offenders pointed to Tyler's age at the time of the crime, to the scientific evidence about adolescent brain development, to the possibility, however remote, that he could have been rehabilitated if given appropriate treatment. They argued that a 13-year-old, regardless of what they had done, should not be written off as irredeemable, that life without parole sentences for children were fundamentally incompatible with principles of human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Those who argued for harsher treatment of violent juvenile offenders pointed to the brutality of the crime, to Tyler's lack of remorse, to the calculated nature of his actions. They argued that some acts are so severe that age becomes less relevant, that a child capable of planning and executing a murder with that level of violence poses a danger to society that cannot be ignored, and that the victim's rights and the community's safety must be balanced against the perpetrator's youth. The Supreme Court had ruled in previous cases that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, that judges must have the discretion to consider individual circumstances. But Tyler's case fell within the parameters of discretionary sentencing. The judge had considered his age, had weighed it against other factors, and had concluded that life without parole was appropriate.
Whether that conclusion was just, whether the system had failed Tyler by not intervening earlier, whether society bore some responsibility for creating conditions that allowed a 13-year-old to become so disturbed without anyone noticing, these were questions without easy answers. The present. Tyler Brennan is now 17 years old.